So last week we reviewed how to respond to the structure question. In this feedback lesson, we will be revisiting the key structural devices used by the author in the Beekeeper of Aleppo, the mark scheme for question 3 on English Language Paper 1, which is the structure question. We will also go over some sample answers. If you find yourself feeling uncertain about question 3, remember it is essentially in what order do things occur and why. And remember that all of you, if you watch TV, if you've ever watched, for instance, Britain's Got Talent, and you recognize the moment when the panel goes, oh, I can't take another one like this, and you know that the next act is going to be a good one, you are capable of and used to identifying patterns. Okay? So really, the structure question is certainly something that we can all do. Remember, when it comes to organizing your structural analysis, that there are some key phrases that you can use in order to make your analysis coherent. The text opens with, as the text progresses, the text closes with, the focus shifts to, and I want to suggest to you that focus and shifts of focus are really important parts of your structural analysis. We are then introduced to, this reminds us of earlier in the text when, later in the text. This builds a structural progression from, to, builds a cumulative effect of. So if we take a look at question 3, remember, just like the language question, you want to highlight the key words. This question, like the language question, is worth 8 marks. Like the language question, you really don't want to be spending more than 12 minutes on this particular question. You now need to think about the whole of the source. The text is from the opening of a novel. How has the writer structured the text to interest you as a reader? You could write about what the writer focuses your attention on at the beginning, so firstly at the start of the text, how and why the structure or the writer changes the focus as the source develops, so as the text progresses or develops, and any other structural feature that interests you. So finally, at the end of the text, if you're talking about the entirety of the text, you should be able to pick up at least 3 out of 8 marks. You also want to remember that question 3, what you're looking at now, it will hardly change at all from test to test. So this is essentially the question that you will get. The difference may be that it might say from the ending or from a climactic part of a novel or novella. But other than that, the question will always be, how has the writer structured the text to interest you as a reader? Okay, so now we're just going to refamiliarize ourselves with the text, and I'm going to read through it. Obviously, if you don't want to listen to me reading, you certainly read it independently, and you have some key questions to sort of guide your reading as you go through and look for structural devices. I am scared of my wife's eyes. She can't see out, and no one can see in. Look, they are like stones, grey stones, sea stones. Look at her. Look how she's sitting on the edge of the bed, her nightgown on the floor, rolling Mohammed's marble around in her fingers and waiting for me to dress her. I am taking my time putting on my shirt and trousers because I am so tired of dressing her. Look at the folds of her stomach, the color of desert honey, darker in the crease, and the fine, fine silver lines in the skin of her breasts and the tips of her fingers with the tiny cuts, where the ridges and valley patterns once were stained with blue or yellow or red paint. Her laughter was gold once. You would have seen as well as heard it. Look at her. Because I think she is disappearing. I had a night of scattered dreams, she says. They filled the room. Her eyes are fixed a little to the left of me. I feel sick. I look at her face, confused. There is still no expression. I don't tell her that I dream only of murder now. Always the same dream. It's only me and the man, and I'm holding the bat and my hand is bleeding. The others aren't there in the dream, and he is on the ground with the trees above him, and he says something to me that I can't hear. And I have pain, she says. Where? Behind my eyes, really sharp pain. I kneel down in front of her and look into her eyes. The blank emptiness in them terrifies me. I take my phone out of my pocket, shine the light of the flashlight into them. Her pupils dilate. I put the phone in my pocket and step away from her. She's been worse since we got here. It's like her soul is evaporating. I'm glad Afra can't see this place. She would like the seagulls, though. The crazy way they fly. In Aleppo, we were far from the sea. I'm sure she would like to see these birds, and maybe even the coast, because she was raised by the sea. I am from eastern Aleppo, where the city meets the desert. When we got married and she came to live with me, Afra missed the sea so much that she started to paint water wherever she found it. Throughout the arid plateau region of Syria, there are oases and streams and rivers that empty into swamps and small lakes. Before we had Sammy, we would follow the water, and she would paint it in oils. There is one painting of the creek I wish I could see again. She made the river look like stormwater drain running through the city park. Afra had this way of seeing truth in landscapes. The measly river in the painting reminded me of a struggle to stay alive. 30 or so kilometers south of Aleppo, the river gives up the struggle of the harsh Syrian steppe and evaporates into the marshes. It might be worth noticing here as well that this is the first time that the narrator names his wife, and it's when she's not in her current setting, but rather this analeptic episode where they're in Syria, in Aleppo, that his wife is most closely associated with Afra, who she was, and a previous identity. And we also learn that her job was to be an artist, which is of course ironic considering she cannot see. I am scared of her eyes, but these damp walls and the wires in the ceiling and the billboards, I'm not sure how she would deal with all this if she could see it. Okay, so if you needed some help planning and writing your analysis of the structure of the text, we have some scaffolding here. So you can open with this idea that the writer starts with a narrow perspective, first person. You have some quotations to use and some of those different devices that you can be mentioning. Shocking for the audience in terms of the effect, creates a state of disequilibrium. There are enigmas about why the wife is blind. There's this tone that something traumatic has occurred, and we know it's from the first person perspective, and also that sense of the second person perspective because the narrator speaks directly to the reader, so it creates a sense of intimacy. So if we look at the middle section of the text, you have a few oh my God! Okay, so in the middle of the text, we have the flashback, I dream only of murder, and the episode with some visceral details that suggest our narrator is not necessarily simply the kind, caring man that his love for his wife suggests. In Aleppo, we are far from the sea, so we have the flashback or analepsis to a different setting, to happier times, and a sense of sort of equilibrium is created, and this setting is juxtaposed or contrasted to their current setting. Okay. And then finally at the end we have that obvious cyclical structure, because I am scared of her eyes is repeated. We talked about the repeated motif of the wife's eyes, but also certainly in that opening paragraph, the use of look, the sort of anaphora of the continuous use of look, and the importance of seeing or the absence of sight. We have this sense that the man is now again frightened, so he's sort of returned to this character who, instead of being violent and angry, is scared, and so we have a sort of re-established empathy for that particular character, because we can see the pain that he and his wife are in. Okay, so now we're going to look at some model responses. There are two versions of model responses on this PowerPoint, and the first one we're going to look at is a level 3, which is sort of a clear response, which would get you 6 out of 8 marks for the structure question. Remember that 6 out of 8 marks would be enough. If you got 3/4 the marks on the paper, that would be enough to get you a high 7 or an 8. As you can see, the light blue highlighted parts of the response relate to structure words or structural devices. Quotations are highlighted in green, and then effects are highlighted in yellow. The text opens with narrow perspective, focusing on the eyes of his wife. I am scared of my wife's eyes. She can't see out and no one can see in. This suggests a sense of disequilibrium and creates enigmas about how the narrator's wife lost her sight. This further signifies a sense of isolation and a distance between the pair as no one can see in, which implies that the wife is alone with her thoughts and feelings, and the husband feels he cannot reach her. So you've got sort of two effects. You've got looking at sort of a smaller part of the longer quotation and several devices. So that would be a clear response. Remember, you don't want to identify individual word parts. Okay, so your second paragraph might look something like this if you're aiming for a level 3 response. As the text progresses, the author focuses on an experience of the narrator. I dream only of murder now. This dream may or may not be an actual memory, hinting at insanity. However, the concrete descriptive details included in the dream, I'm holding the bat and my hand is bleeding, suggest that the violent incident actually occurred, momentarily preventing the reader from feeling any empathy for the narrator. Furthermore, the reader may even fear the narrator, as he has been shown to be a character capable of violence. This violent aspect of the narrator's character is contrasted with the care and tenderness he shows his wife. Okay, so this is the third paragraph in that level 3 response, 6 out of 8 marks. Later on in the text, the author uses a cyclical structure, returning to the repeated motif, focusing on the wife's eyes. I am scared of her eyes. This return to the wife emphasizes the significance of the relationship between the narrator and his wife, and his concern for her. The narrator's expression of fear, being scared, helps to recreate empathy and demonstrates an emotional weakness in spite of the flashes of violence previously referred to. Okay, so if you can write 3 paragraphs focusing on sort of the beginning, the middle, and the end of the text, using appropriate structural devices, listing 2 clear effects, then you're looking at a 6 out of 8. Okay, if you would like to look at a level 4 response, so a full 8 out of 8 marks, the next 4 slides would be a sort of full mark response. Okay, so now we're going to look at some example paragraphs. They're probably all three a little bit lengthy, but using the details as sort of the initial slides that have some of those ideas that can be incorporated into your structural analysis. They are fairly well developed, and remember again, to get the full marks, to get 8 out of 8, you need really developed structural analysis. Just to sort of reiterate, while you might use micro quotes, you do not want to be labeling the word type. You don't want to consider the connotations of the words because it's not a language question, it's a structure question. So you're thinking about what happens without sentences and relating different events together as opposed to thinking so much about what happens within a sentence, okay? Because that would be language. So we'll look at the example and then we're going to look at how the example meets the mark scheme or the success criteria. The author opens the text with a narrow first-person perspective, focusing on the eyes of his wife. I'm scared of my wife's eyes. She can't see out and no one can see in. This immediately establishes a sense of disequilibrium and creates enigmas about how the narrator's wife lost her sight. This further signifies a sense of isolation and discord between the pair as no one can see in. In addition, sight or an absence of sight is a repeated motif throughout the opening as the narrator repeatedly and ironically implores the reader to look, creating a sense of troubling intimacy as the narrator goes on to describe his wife's physical appearance using concrete details, focusing on the folds of her stomach, her breasts, her fingertips, all of which create an air of physical substantiality, which is contrasted with the sense of absence. I think she's disappearing. So again, you want to see how sentences, ideas work together. It is as if the narrator wishes to hold on to the presence of his wife by recording for the reader the details of that physical presence. Okay, so here you can see that the example has been highlighted to indicate where the mark scheme has been met. The light blue indicates structural devices, structural words. The yellow, those are your effects, and the green are the quotations that you use. And while you can see that there are micro quotes, again, there's no identification of the word type, and there's no sense of the individual connotations of words. Okay, so here's your second paragraph, and again, we're just looking at the whole text, sort of the beginning, the middle, and the end, and the different structural devices contained within each of those parts. Furthermore, the author then progresses the narrative by focusing on a traumatic episode experienced by the narrator. I dream only of murder now. The dream may or may not be an actual memory, hinting at insanity or mental instability. However, the visceral details included in that dream, I'm holding the bat and my hand is bleeding, suggests that the violent incident actually occurred, momentarily suspending any empathy the reader may have felt for the narrator. The violent aspect of the narrator's persona is juxtaposed with the care and tenderness he shows his wife. This episode also suggests that our narrator, like his wife, is not existing concretely in reality, in the present, showing the cumulative effect of their shared trauma. The author then includes an analeptic episode, shifting focus to a happier time. In Aleppo, we were far from the sea, which creates a temporary sense of equilibrium and creates enigmas about the traumas shared by the couple and what caused their dangerous flight from Aleppo. Okay, and the final paragraph of structural analysis focuses on the end of the text. Later on in the text, the author uses a cyclical structure to return to the repeated motif of sight and sightlessness by focusing on the wife's eyes again. I am scared of her eyes. This return to the wife has the cumulative effect of emphasizing the significance of the relationship between the narrator and his wife and his concern for her. The narrator's honest expression of his fear, being scared, helps to re-establish empathy and demonstrates an emotional vulnerability in spite of the flashes of violence previously referred to. The author shifts back to the present, ending the temporary reprieve created by the analeptic episode, returning to the bleak setting of their current situation. These damp walls and the wires in the ceiling and the billboards contrasted with the previous reference to the beautiful landscape of Aleppo, and creating a sense of claustrophobia and despair. The narrator's concern that his wife would not be able to deal with all of this suggests that he likewise is struggling to cope with the bleakness of their current surroundings. Okay, so now what you need to do is you need to have a look at the paragraphs that you've written. Look at your own structural analysis. The first thing I'd like you to do is go through those paragraphs, identify where you've used structural devices. So structural devices will be things like equilibrium, disequilibrium, flashback, or analepsis. Label those as structural devices or label them with a D. Structure words will be things like progression, previously, later on in the text, focuses. Those are structure words, and you can label those with a W. Your effect on the reader, and again, making sure that those are as specific as possible, they're not vague, making the reader want to read on. Comments like that will probably get you 2 out of 8. So you really need to be as specific as you can. Use appropriate and sophisticated adjectives to describe the emotions that are evoked. Label those with an E. And your quotations, your micro quotes, you need to label those with a Q. Remember, do not identify the word type. Once you've gone through and labeled those things, you need to have a look at the checklist. What are the things that you're struggling with? Are you struggling to identify structural devices, to select appropriate quotations? Is your analysis not quite detailed enough? Are you struggling to use those structure words to order your analysis? So please give yourself a target and then consider how confident you're feeling with structural devices. I think maybe we feel like we're not familiar with structure, and this particular question is one that typically students struggle with, but you're certainly capable of doing it, and once you've mastered some of the basic ideas, it shouldn't be a question that's too difficult.